raise a question, a very important question, a very significant question that comes up from time to time in regards to African people. And it is a matter that is raised in particular around emancipation. And it is something that we must confront. And it is basically the question of whether or not we as African people should blame slavery for our current condition. Of course, our young men are filling the jails, but not filling the universities. We are the largest consumers, but the smallest producers. We eat out the most, but we own the least restaurants. We buy the most food, but we own the least supermarkets. We wear the finest clothes, but own the least clothing stores. We drink so much alcohol, smoke so much cigarettes, but we make other people rich by our self-destructive habits and activities. And when it comes to land ownership, business entrepreneurship, we find our people lagging behind. Merged with that, we find ourselves locked in a cycle or condition of self-hatred as a result of the loss of our name, language, religion, culture, our traditions, our heritage of Africa. And we find ourselves at the bottom of the social strata within modern society. So the question arises, do we blame slavery for this? So let's look very, very quickly. Firstly, African people in the motherland continent were living a civilized life with culture and refinement, prosperity. African people gave science, mathematics, art, culture and philosophy and civilization to the whole world. We wrote the alphabet, we developed the number system, we built the pyramids. We had the first libraries in Africa. We had the first universities in Africa. We had the first schools and learning centers in Africa. And in our traditional African societies, we did not have old age homes because we were not abandoning our elderly. We did not have orphanages because we were not abandoning our children. We didn't even have prisons in early traditional African societies because we weren't breaking the law. We didn't have halfway houses and drug rehabilitation centers and other kinds of social services that were designed for individuals that found themselves outside of the loop of sane society. We didn't have mental institutions or insane asylums. So there was a certain standard of refinement and civilization in traditional African societies. And then, of course, at around 400 years ago, we were brought over here to the Western Hemisphere, enslaved, became the victims of the most brutal and cruel crimes ever committed against humanity in all the annals of history. And then we find ourselves in the current situation that we're in today. So the question still stands, but do we blame slavery for this? Before I answer the question, let's go just a bit further. We were brought across here as cattle, like animals, packed into slave ships, chained together, submerged in our own filth, vomit, feces, and urine. And then they will bring us up on deck, scrub our naked bodies with salt water, bristle brushes, then throw us back underneath the deck, throw our food down there, which we would scrape up each other. Babies were born down in the deck. Babies would die. Old people would die, chained to each other. Sometimes you're chained next to a dead body for days upon days. Then we will get to the West Indies or the Americas. They will march us out, put us on a stage, oil our bodies down to shine in the sun so they could see our muscles, shave our heads clean, and there'll be screaming audiences of white people calling out prices to buy and sell us. The father will be sold to one plantation, the mother to another plantation, children will be sent to other plantations, and then the men were now used as stud horses to breed stronger slaves, so we were like sex machines for the economy of the European people. Meanwhile, our women were raped repeatedly and consistently. The men were denied the right to be fathers and husbands. The women were denied the right to be mothers or caregivers to their children. And then, the Emancipation Proclamation is signed by the British Parliament, and then we are said to be free or emancipated. But this did not socially reform or mend and repair all of the damage that was done to us consistently and continuously for all of those generations. So abolition took place in 1807. Then apprenticeship began in 1834. There was full emancipation on August 1st, 1838. So we left the plantations because clearly we did not want to continue to work and live treated like animals, worse than animals, as slaves under those conditions. So we left. But 2 years later, in Trinidad and Tobago and other parts of the British West Indies, they wrote squatter laws. Because they had all these massive plantations that were making so much money during slavery. But now all of the workers left. So they now need to get the workers to come back. So what they did was they changed and wrote laws. So they called us squatters and told us that we are now breaking the law because we're not paying for the land that they kidnapped us and brought us on. So now we're called squatters. So they wrote squatter law. So some African people put together money to try to buy land. Then they changed the law again and said the minimum purchase of land that you can buy is 340 acres. So some African people still scrape together money to buy some land. But then they changed the law again. Lord Harris and Governor MacLeod and many of these British governors used the law to try to keep African people poor and propertyless. So they changed the law another time. This time the minimum purchase of land was 680 acres. But still, through the tenacity and ambition of many of the Africans, we still pooled our monies together to purchase full square miles of land, 680 acres. And then in 1846, they passed the Master's Servants Ordinance, again using the law to target African people to try to keep us poor, because the Master Servants Ordinance was designed to ensure that African people were not landowners nor entrepreneurs. So, we went through the colonial era. 1925, there is partial adult suffrage. Some people were allowed to vote, mainly men who had land, who could speak English and had a certain amount of money. Then in 1946, there was full adult suffrage. Everyone was allowed to vote. And then, of course, in 1962, we became independent. And so, party politics appeared to be a means through which African people could become empowered. But 8 years after independence, in 1962, there was a Black Power revolution in 1970 because independence did not solve the problems that African people had. So, one researcher by the name of Acton Camejo at the University of the West Indies did a research. He went to the Register of Companies at the University of the West Indies and determined in 1970 that 50% of the elites in Trinidad were foreign white. 20% of the elites in Trinidad were local white. A smaller percentage were Chinese, some were Indians, but 4%, only 4% of the elites were Africans. Now think, white people were 1% of the population, but yet still 70% of the elites. African people were more than 50% of the population, but only 4% of the elites. And then that imbalance, that perpetual injustice, unequal distribution of wealth within the system, the oppression, exploitation, and tyranny that black people have suffered, not just overtly, but covertly through the system, has brought us to a current condition, as we explained in the beginning, with the social crisis that black people find themselves in. Now, the question is, do we blame slavery for this? No, we don't blame slavery, because we today are competent, capable, qualified, and educated enough to get ourselves out of any of those snares and traps that we've fallen into over time, where the law was used against black people to keep us poor, oppressed, landless, and propertyless. We today have the intelligence, the strength within community, the potential economic spending power, the spiritual understanding, the history and knowledge of the philosophies and ideologies that have been shared with the masses of African people through such great liberators and thinkers like the Honorable Elijah Muhammad, like the great Marcus Garvey, like Trinidad and Tobago's own Kwame Ture. We've had so many leaders and teachers and examples such as Malcolm X, Dr. Martin Luther King. And today, the Honorable Minister Louis Farrakhan, we've had so many inspirational examples that have set the way to what pure black liberation thought can do to transform a people. So no, we don't blame slavery for the condition that we're in, because we can get out of it in spite of slavery. However, slavery is a factor in getting us into this condition. And if we ignore that, we would be at a loss as it pertains to finding reasonable and workable practical solutions to solving the problems that we face today as black people. So I say, in closing, that there are those on the outside of the black community now who want to tell us, don't blame slavery for your problems. You see, the liberation of the black man's mind represents a threat to those who benefit and profit from the exploitation and oppression of African people. Don't let anyone on the outside of your community tell you how to feel your pain. It is out of place for anyone outside of the black community to suggest to us how we should treat with our own history. That is ours. It's our suffering. It's our hurt. It's our pain. And we will deal with it accordingly. But we cannot have other ethnic groups dictate to us our agenda. Hence, the theme for the Emancipation Support Committee's Emancipation season for 2013 was institutionalizing the African agenda. Well, this is the black agenda. We were black before we were African, but of course we're African people, but black is universal. And to institutionalize the black agenda, we have to set our own agenda. Through our own ideas, through education, land ownership, business entrepreneurship, family reorganization, and the mastery of modern technology. We have to ensure that our children, the next generation, are embracing the consciousness that is required for them themselves to be young liberators, so that the generation following them could also be led into the promised land of knowledge, wisdom, and understanding, so that we can bring about the kind of necessary change that is required, and we must do it with God. We cannot afford to continue to be divided and disunited by a multitude of different religious belief systems and ideologies. We have to recognize the oneness of God, the oneness of us as a people. We have to love one another as black people and continue to struggle, because it is a struggle, which means there will be trials and tribulations, difficulties, obstacles, barriers, and challenges in the process of getting to where we want to go. But we must recognize that it is a struggle, and we must recognize that struggle is ordained.